Hello, everybody. As we get towards the end of 2025, we're doing some shows summarizing the year and looking forward to 2026 with old friends of the show. And one of those I'm honored to say is Ray Suarez, the voice in some ways of national public radio. He was on the show in late 2024 talking about what it means to be an American in the 2020s. Back then, he had a new book out, We Are Home, Becoming American in the 21st Century, an oral history. And for me, Ray's always been the kind of voice of America, in the sense that when I first came to America, I used to listen to him on national public radio religiously, particularly his excellent show. It's not just his, Talk of the Nation. So I'm thrilled that Ray is joining us today. Ray, where are you? In Washington, D.C.?
I'm in my home studio in Washington, yeah.
So, Ray, what kind of year has 2025 been for you?
Shocking. I was among those people who underestimated how far the newly restored Trump government would go after they returned to office in the third week of January, and they have never ceased to amaze me. Whether it's the unconventional cabinet put in place, the open corruption at a shocking level, or of particular interest to me, the enforcement efforts in the area of immigration. It's been a year that's just been jaw-dropping in a lot of ways. And, you know, as a reporter, I'm by habit, by life habit, I'm always trying to play it straight. But this year, I've covered Washington for over 30 years. This is unlike any other presidential administration I've ever seen, including Trump's first time through the White House. So, yeah, 2025 is definitely one for the books.
I don't want to start predicting 2026 yet, Ray, but we've had so many conversations, particularly about Trump, with people like yourself saying, well, this has never happened before. For the first time in American history, this has happened or that has happened. Do you feel that that every time he does something different, he shocks someone in different ways, that he's almost catering to critics like yourself?
Well, I'm not the hand-wringing type. I'm not the catastrophizing type that whenever a new policy or a new initiative is announced, immediately going to the worst possible outcome and saying, oh no, this is going to happen. But again and again this year, they have fooled me. They have surprised me with the degree to which they are willing to lie to judges, basically turn Congress into a neutered institution, use the military at home. You know, I grew up in Washington as a reporter where Republicans were still institutionalists and still at least paid lip service to the idea that there were separate branches, co-equal and with differing responsibilities. All of that's been thrown into the hopper. I hate being that person who says, oh no, here we go again. But here we go again. It just never ceases to amaze me now.
Your book last year is called We Are Home, Becoming American in the 21st Century. It's an oral history. And I know for you, America is important in the context of it being a home. Does that add to the tragedy and the pain of watching America in 2025, that it's home for you? It's almost as if some stranger comes into your house and trashes it up.
I have always believed, from the time that I could actually put words to the thought, that this country was a multi-century project trying to become that more perfect union, The way we use the words in the 21st century may be different from the way they used them in the 18th, but it still works. We were always striving toward becoming better versions of ourselves. But this political season, dating back from the time when Joe Biden was showing his physical weakness, his inability likely to make the whole race in 2024, dating from that, we've unleashed the furies, shown how red in tooth and claw, how ferocious we could be as a people. We have given away the game, shown that we don't really think of ourselves as a people of laws, as a people constrained by laws, as long as you can be the strongest person in the room and get away with what you intended to do. That is a shocking development. That is a terrible development. To see people who throughout their Washington careers have called themselves conservatives be seduced by this idea that if you're powerful enough to get away with something, you should do it, is really a striking development.
Some people might be watching this, Ray, and thinking to themselves, well, Suarez is articulating that progressive narrative of American history, this perfection, or this narrative, this journey towards perfection, towards becoming a better and better country, different, unique in the community of nations around the world. And the reality is that America is no better or no worse than anywhere else. And what he's describing is reality. He's just coming to recognize that that American history is like any other history of any other nation. How would you respond to that critique?
If they want to put on my tombstone, the last idealist, that's fine. I'm okay with that. If you plot out the long march of American history from the drafting of the Constitution in 1789, or from the Declaration of Independence, whose 250th anniversary we'll celebrate next year, the slice of humanity that was going to be protected by law, whose rights were going to be made sacred by law, has constantly widened over time. That's been the great genius of the American project, to create an owner's manual, if you will, that we acknowledged from the beginning might need fixing over time. So we made the Constitution amendable, and we did it another 26 times. We always knew that there would be change. If you want to call that progressive, fine. We recognize the humanity of Black Americans, which at the time the Constitution was enshrined, we did not. We most certainly did not. We acknowledge the humanity and full political rights, at least in writing. It took another 100 years to actually ratify and codify those rights, but at least we took a shot at it in those immediately post-Civil War constitutional amendments. We gave women the right to vote. We examined, then re-examined, then examined again ourselves and our laws that govern how people come here from other places in the world. And we constantly opened the doors. We have decidedly turned our back on those ideas. There are people talking about repealing or overriding Obergefell versus Hodges, thus leaving hundreds of thousands of same-sex couples that got married in limbo, in legal limbo for the rest of their married lives. We're talking about taking another look at Loving v. Virginia, which is just kind of crazy. We are definitely going to take another look at Wong Kim Ark versus USA, which was decided in the closing years of the 19th century and enshrined birthright citizenship in law. This is a revanchist And it's not a conservative project. This is a retrograde project in a lot of ways. It seeks to repeal the second half of the 20th century.
You describe it as revanchist and retrograde. You're from Puerto Rico. America has a long history of colonialism in Latin America, and particularly in the 19th century, of course. Some people now are describing Trump's approach to Latin America as being the Donroe Doctrine, in reference to the Monroe Doctrine. To what extent is this a return, Ray, to 19th century colonial American history, viewing Latin America as being part of America's backyard and having every right to do whatever they like, whether it's Venezuela or Cuba or anywhere else?
Well, there's soft and silly insistences upon that idea, like renaming the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America. And then there's really hard, fist-like insistences, like blowing up boats in the Caribbean and not sharing how you know who's on that boat and what's on that boat. And now information is coming to light that shows that that boat may not have been headed toward the United States at all. The one that's gotten the most controversial attention, where wounded men were clinging to the wreckage of a boat struck by a Hellfire missile. We are pushing around Latin America, flexing our muscle, just boarding an oil tanker headed for Cuba, because we, as a third-party nation, have decided that oil pumped out of the ground in Venezuela, loaded onto a tanker, and then sent to another country still again, Cuba, is somehow ours to be interfered with or taken. It is very much a 19th and, let's say, first half of the 20th century attitude toward Latin America.
And Latin America, of course, is increasingly central, both in America's, or many Americans' paranoia and ambition, colonial ambition. On the one hand, there's policies in Venezuela and Cuba and much else of Central and Latin America. And then, of course, there's this fear, this paranoia about Central and Latin American migrants. How do those go together, Ray? Is there a contradiction between the fact that on the one hand, America wants to be in Latin America, and on the other hand, America doesn't want Latin Americans in the United States?
It's the living out of that tension that's always been there. Here we just experienced an election in Honduras where President Trump said to the people of the country, elect the guy I want, or else endanger the aid you get. Now, I'm not going to be Pollyanna-ish about that and say that that's not the kind of thing we did in the past. It is, but we stopped. And if there were assurances being made behind closed doors through diplomatic channels about American displeasure about this policy or that one, that at least preserved the notion of sovereignty and independence among these nations that throughout their whole existence have been pushed around by the United States. It is a fascinating thing to watch a guy who really doesn't know anything about America south of the Rio Grande, about the Americas south of the Rio Grande, embracing that old idea about how to deal with these countries, whether it's embracing Nayib Bukele and sending prisoners to his gulag-like detention center in El Salvador, or pardoning an international drug criminal and setting him free, dictating who voters in countries that we zealously desired, or said we did, zealously desired to be democracies, telling them who they should vote for. It brings up all the worst old stereotypes about how the United States should and does deal with its neighbors.
And yet, Ray, some people might be watching this, particularly if they're partial to Donald Trump and the MAGA movement, and say, well, that's all very well. Maybe some of what Ray is saying is true. And yet, there was a significant minority of Latin Americans who voted for Trump in the last election and still support him.
They feel that the promises made to them by the Democrats in 2020 were not kept. And that was a vote that showed just how annoyed they were. They were ready to take a chance on Donald Trump, and they did. Let's be clear. He didn't win the Latino vote, but he did better than a lot of recent Republican candidates have. And I'll be interested to see what happens in 2026. Unless I miss my guess, he won't be getting 43, 44%. The Republicans won't be getting 43, 44% when Election Day rolls around in 2026.
Ray, you wrote this oral history of becoming American in the 21st century. You have a particular interest in the Latin American community. As I said, your family's from Puerto Rico. Are there any generalizations either from the book in these interviews you did or from your conversations this year? You spend a lot of your time traveling around America, talking to all sorts of different peoples in a Studs Terkel-like fashion. When it comes to immigration, I mean, the liberal elites on the West and East Coast, I'm on the West Coast, you're on the East Coast. Some of them seem partial almost to an open border policy. Are the people on the ground, first generation, second generation migrants, are they more realistic perhaps about what America should and shouldn't do when it comes to people wanting to come and live in this country?
Well, they are more exposed to the ways that large numbers of people coming in, an influx of new people, can change the contours of a labor market. You and I are not going to have our jobs taken by somebody who overstays their visa and ends up working in a restaurant. You and I aren't going to have our livelihoods threatened by somebody who makes their way across the southern border with a coyote and ends up on a construction site in Denver or Phoenix. They are. And so their ambivalence about all these things, very well aware that their own families' histories may have involved illegal crossings, may have involved visa overstays, may have involved getting somebody legal by marrying them. That's all true. But the further that it is in the past, the less willing they are to countenance the damage that it may do to their ability to get over in America, which many of them are still struggling to do. So when I spoke to people in preparation for the book, when I spoke to people while I was touring and lecturing around the book, they had this duality, this feeling that I'm very grateful that the country took me in. I'm not happy if immigrants are mistreated because I was one, or my mother was one, or my father was one. And at the same time, things seemed to have gotten out of control, and I didn't want chaos either. And, it's not exactly all one thing or another.
Ray, as I said, you were, and you in some ways continue to be the voice, in my mind at least, of public radio. You were the presenter for many years of Talk of the Nation. I used to listen religiously, traditional top-down media. A lot of people argue that what's happened in America, this degeneration in some ways into cruelty, particularly on the right, but perhaps also on the left, is a consequence of the disappearance of men like Ray Suarez. And we no longer have these authoritative voices. You were an inheritor of people like Walter Cronkite and Alistair Cook. Do you think there's any truth to that critique?
I think there's a lot to it, actually. I think the lack of sort of plumb lines, straight up and down measurements by which you could understand where you stand in relation to them, the sort of leveling of the field, the loss of authority, the leeching of authority out of big media institutions, the death of 1,000 cuts that American newspapers have experienced. This has all contributed to a general growth in mistrust, a general evacuation from the public square of a sort of consensus idea of America, and it's a dangerous thing. You know, the world that I grew up in, and it's a terrible thing to grow up in one era and have to live out another one. But when the president would call the heads of the three networks and say, I want to go on tonight, he went on that night on all three networks, and that was that. Now the president is very reluctant to do that if it's a Democrat. If it's a Republican, he is very sure that there are alternative ways to get that same message out and doesn't want to go on all the networks. So that old universe, an orderly, almost Ptolemaic universe, has been succeeded by Copernican chaos, and we are not necessarily the better for it. It's flattened media. In some ways, it's democratized media. If you've got a microphone and some tools and some skills, you can find an audience, which is a wonderful thing. The old gatekeepers that kept talented people out of the field are pretty much gone or going, and that's good too. But with that comes a new paradigm that we really haven't built a business model around. So people are just going bankrupt or don't know how to make a living at this thing. And the public is not very well served by 1,000 voices screaming at them, 500 of which may be either inaccurate or just lying.
Ray, again, a conservative watching this, listening to Ray Suarez, the voice of National Public Radio, the presenter of Talk of the Nation, talk about consensual ideas, might disagree and say that Ray, and I'm politically probably in your community, Ray, so it didn't bother me that much, but that National Public Radio in the 90s, even 20 years ago, was presented itself as consensual and reflecting mainstream views and all the rest of it. But actually, it was the politics of the left, and that Ray Suarez is a classic example of a progressive who had too much power in media and now is just one voice against many. Is there any truth to that critique? Not necessarily of you personally, but of the fact that the networks and the mainstream newspapers tended and still tend to be dominated by progressives?
I really have always thought that was, especially in the commercial. I worked half my career in commercial media. I always thought that was kind of a crock. What you were getting more often than a liberal view was an upper middle class view of America. And it was an educated view. In the case of National Public Radio, it was a thoughtful, well-modulated, and liberal arts degree view. But it wasn't necessarily politically radical or even very much to the left. It was, and all media is, if anything, up until recently, status quo driven, not driven toward progressive ideas, not driven toward social change, but very much tolerant of, deferential to things as they are. You interview people who are in power and you recognize that they have power and you try to find out what they're willing to tell you. I mean, I was on the NewsHour on PBS for many years, more years than I was on National Public Radio. And that was a deferential establishment, sort of almost like a court chronicle of Washington, D.C., very deferential to people in power, very careful not to step on toes. And every time I would be accused by somebody of being a leftist because I'm on the PBS NewsHour, I could laugh my head off. The idea was ridiculous.
Maybe that's true, but then who wants deferential media?
Well, no, I think that was totally a mistaken view of how to do that work. But there I was. I didn't own it. I wasn't my own boss. I was trying to give as honest an account of what was happening in the world that day as I possibly could within the constraints that I was given to work in. I was not a big fan of some of the decisions, editorial decisions that were made by my boss, and we would hash it out in morning meetings. He would win because he was the boss. Sometimes I'd win because I was able to be persuasive enough. And yeah, I mean, it wasn't necessarily great as a model either, but it certainly wasn't lefty media.
This year, you've also been presenting a series on PBS called Wisdom Keepers. So, in a sense, I'm not suggesting it's deferential or progressive, but it certainly is more traditional than much of social media or even the podcasting world. What is Wisdom Keepers, Ray? And what are you trying to do? What exactly is wisdom itself? Have you discovered that in 2025?
Well, we ask smart people to talk about how we got to where we are now, both narrowly in the United States.
And this is a PBS show, isn't it?
And this is a PBS show.
Is it publicly funded or funded by private organizations?
A lot of individual donors, and our production platform is Fordham University in New York, a Catholic university of a pretty good reputation. And they took us on and are our production platform. And we have spoken to theologians and philosophers and physicians and journalists and all kinds of people, the ethicists of war, talking about the rules of battle and how they've changed as armaments and weapons have changed. It's been just such a treat for me to run up and down the supermarket of smart people's heads, throwing things in my basket. For someone, granted, toward the end of my career, it's really kind of a perfect assignment. And when I got a cold call from the executive producer, William Baker, who was a longtime executive in public broadcasting, he said, "I can't think of anybody better to do this job." And I said, "Well, that's very flattering, but even if you could think of somebody better, I want to do it." And it's been a real romp for me, a lot of fun.
Yeah, I wish they'd called me. You go from everyone from David Brooks to Kevin Kelly. Brooks always struck me as the kind of guy who some people might pick out as a kind of top-down media figure who is a little bit out of touch with mainstream America.
And in a lot of ways, he's an exemplar of everything that you've been talking about.
Yeah, and I don't want to turn this into a critique of David Brooks, but did you find in these interviews, when you're interviewing people like Brooks, that these guys now get it, that the world is changing? Sometimes when I read Brooks in the Times, one gets the sense that he's still writing in the 1980s or 90s. Same with Thomas Friedman and some of the other columnists there.
I've known David for a long time, and he always jokingly referred to himself as a young fogey.
Yeah.
He was a kind of odd duck for Washington, very young in a lot of ways and very old in a lot of ways.
And conservative. Young people are not supposed to be conservative, and yet he was.
He has had a series of life-changing experiences, life-changing revelations. He has really started to think about life and what he's here for in a very different way. And that's what I spent a lot of time with him on, both the loss of the American consensus and this sort of wild age and where it's brought us, but also about the changes in him. He's become far more religious, and that has driven him back to the books, and he's read all the great philosophers and theologians. And, we were talking about him reading Aquinas and so on. And he is, I don't want to tell tales out of school. I don't know if David would necessarily use this term, but he's in a lot of ways a changed man. And I hope people find the conversation that I have with him refreshing, because it was just after the publication of his book, How to Know Someone. And he's talking in a very deep and thoughtful and decent way about how to really get to know people, to set aside this sophisticated pose that he's so used to here in Washington, that arm's length thing that we do here, and really, really exchange things that mean a lot to you with people that you meet and people that you get to know. And this is emblematic of the ways that I think he's changed. And that's why I wanted to talk to him.
Yeah, and he's used his writing skills and his broadcast skills, I think, as a kind of confessional. You also talked to Kevin Kelly, old friend of mine, someone I've been involved with in a debate for many years about whether technology can make the world a better place or a less good place. What was your, before we get to Kelly, what's your take, Ray, on this roaring debate now about how technology seems to be destroying America, social media, AI now? Do you have strong feelings in this, or do you recognize
I
that?
do. And I have generally, over the past 35 years, tried to quietly insert into the conversation that technology and the technological advancements of this last generation have been great, but we ought to be skeptical about them. We ought to really strenuously interrogate how they're going to change life, how they're going to change work, how they're going to change us. We haven't. We've listened to the siren song of the techno utopians who tell us this is all going to be just great. And it's not going to be all just great. It has unlocked productivity, adventure, tremendous progress, and profits. But it's also, I think, rewired our brains in ways that we haven't fully taken account of, and we seem not to want to take fully account of.
Ray, you've also used media in a confessional way. You've written extensively about your own financial struggles, about leaving PBS. What should public figures like yourself should and shouldn't say in the public arena? I mean, it seems as if you're not typical of this, but it seems as if public figures these days are more and more confessional about their sex life, their sexual identities, their relations. And some people find it quite refreshing. Others find it a little disturbing.
I would have been only too happy to get through the entire balance of my career without ever using the word I, or using it only sparingly. I was old-fashioned in that regard. You mentioned writing about my financial setbacks after I left PBS. That was not something that came naturally to me. It was not something that was my instinctual move when, after 40 years in the news business, I couldn't find work. It was something that I fell back on when I started to dig in and do more research into the career trajectories of late in life workers, and used my own story as a way of opening that door to talking about what men in America go through in their late 50s and early 60s. I've written extensively and talked about my diagnosis and treatment for cancer. Again, that was not something that came to me that easily. I wasn't someone throughout my career who used the personal as a doorway into the professional. It wasn't my go-to move. But in this case, I think it made a lot of sense, and I was trying to encourage men to be more diligent about their diagnostic screens, and use myself as an example of trying not to find out too late that you're sick.
Yeah, and your piece, which I remember reading, and being quite, I won't say impressed, but certainly it resonated with me. Sinking feeling. You wrote a piece for the Washington Post about the experience of feeling redundant and financially on very thin ice. Of course, in our age of AI in 2020, late 25 and 2026, I'm guessing that more and more people are going to have that sinking feeling, especially middle-aged men.
Every day, and I'm not exaggerating, every day I get some sort of communication asking me to work as a voiceover artist or a narrator And it's only when you dig down into the second and third level of the solicitation that what they really want you to do is train AI. And
Wow.
you know, it's really something to say. I've done audio books, I've done a documentary series, and been a narrator and a voiceover artist. And so I think, oh, all right, yeah, here's a payday. And I start clicking through and start trying to get more information. And I realize, yeah, they want to put me in a room and have me say a lot of words to a robot so that someday you'll call somewhere or turn on a radio or Sirius XM, and a guy who's not me but sounds like me is going to be telling you things. No thanks.
You say no thanks, but what's wrong with that, Ray? If indeed the AI is accurate and entertaining and relevant in 50 or 100 years, why wouldn't somebody want to listen to the resonant voice of Ray Suarez talking about the world?
In 50 or 100 years, swell. I will be dust somewhere. But in 3 or 5 years, when I and people like me can't get work because robots are doing it all, I will have helped pave that road. And, all other things being equal, I'd rather not have part of my living made by making it harder for people who do the work I do to get work. Yes, you may say it's coming anyway, but I don't have to do it.
Well, one thing that is definitely coming, for better or worse, is 2026. I know you're involved with a project with your daughter to write a book. You're very much involved with the Episcopal Diocese of Washington. Your daughter is a clergy woman. What does 2026 promise in that sense? And it sounds like a very exciting project, intellectually, of course, but also personally for you.
Well, the publishers, Church Publishing, are very excited about the project because it's intergender, intergenerational, lay and clergy, and I think, obviously, and father-daughter. So it pushes a lot of different buttons. This little kid that I took to church with me every week is now baptizing babies and burying people who die and helping grief-stricken families. And she is an adult out there doing the work of keeping the church alive as an institution in the 21st century. And what we're going to be asking about is how to keep the lights on, how to keep the church as a vital institutional member of society. How do you keep it meaning a lot to a lot of people at a time when a lot of people have been saying either no thanks or just not for me? There may be in 2026 and 27 some reconsideration there. A lot of young people, the sort of hemorrhaging of young people from the pews across America is slowing down. Some demographers say it's stopping. We'll be checking on that and talking to people both who are staying and leaving about why, to understand what religious institutions can be doing to get their places ready for the balance of the century.
When's the book going to be out?
Mid-27.
So when we talk again next year, I hope, Ray, more than once, but you'll certainly be back on the show in December, excuse me, of 2026. Final questions. I'm not going to ask you for some sort of cheesy prediction of what's going to happen, who's going to win elections. That one's hard. But let's end with a two-part question. When you and I talk again in December 2026, in 12 months' time, what would you like to see, firstly? And secondly, what do you most fear in the American context?
I'd like to see a rebalancing of the distribution of power in the United States in a way that recognizes law as it's written, that recognizes the various branches of government and their separated powers. I'd like to see a sort of a moment where we sort of catch ourselves and say, whoo, let's think about what we're doing. The country's going to continue to change. The country is going to continue to change in ways that some people are not going to like and some people are going to like a lot. We got to talk to each other and we have to understand what we're doing and be more judicious, I guess. I would hope that the 2026 elections bring in a little bit more caution on the part of our politicians from all parties and from all political convictions. What I fear next year is some real economic damage. I think the combination of a president who is willing to put really overt pressure on the Federal Reserve to lower interest rates beyond where the governors may decide they want them to be, increases the money supply at a time when the cost of labor is going to be going up because the age cohorts that are coming on stream in the United States are smaller. The workforce is getting older. They're trying to deport as many working age people as possible. So labor costs are going to go up. The money supply is going to go up. And tariffs are going to reduce the amount of goods. And when you reduce goods and make money easier to get your hands on, you unleash the devils of inflation. And it could be a really, really dismaying year for a lot of people who say they're already finding it hard to afford their lives. I worry about that a lot, and not without reason.
Well, there you have it. He's going to have on his tombstone, America's last idealist, Ray Suarez, old friend of the show, Ray. Happy, healthy new year. And we will certainly talk again in the new year. I think your vision, your economic vision is a very chilling one, but also not unrealistic. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, Andrew. Happy New Year.